Hi, my name is Nick Lukenbach. I am a computer engineering and psychology major, and my project is a machine learning fMRI autism classifier. The summary of this project is that I built a program which examines the functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of patients with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, and healthy controls, and it tries to guess which group those patients belong to based on the scan. The reasoning for doing so is that ASD is a disorder which is increasing in prevalence, has become fairly common among children, and earlier diagnosis can greatly improve outcomes. That said, the diagnosis is done through a therapist looking at behaviors alone. There isn't really a consistent set of biomarkers, which are objective physiological indications of the disorder. So with a fMRI scanner, we're able to look at brain activity as opposed to just structure, which is what you would see in a structural MRI. And we can find the brain signals that are happening in any given moment by looking at the BOLD response, which is a blood oxygenation level dependent curve, which occurs when a certain region of the brain is consuming more energy and thus more oxygen. And the brain responds by flooding that area with an increase of oxygenated blood, which can be picked up on the scanner as a brighter signal. So with standard statistical techniques, you can look at just the activation between regions. You can look at the correlation between pairs of regions. But when it comes to producing a biomarker, a machine learning classifier can take us another step forwards by examining the network connectivity between the entire brain, which allows for just more information to be included in a single diagnosis, as opposed to merely looking at differences when you already know the labels in advance. In order to get these regions and the correlations between them, we have to first parcellate the brain into a series of different regions. I selected them based on anatomical features, and I have 127 different parcellated regions, and that goes to produce the correlation matrix here. So the correlation matrix you see on the left is the raw correlations between all 127 regions, and the one on the right underwent a thresholding technique I used. This thresholding technique took the top 10% most highly correlated regions and the bottom 10%, which are still strong correlations, but they're strong negative correlations. So here you see the most highly correlated regions and the strongest anti-correlated regions. When using this technique, the model performance was quite high. Under ideal settings with a fairly small sample size, just 100 of each group, with not a lot of variance between each subject, this was controlled for features like age and IQ. We see very, very high performance accuracy. This is also using very, very aggressive cross-validation techniques. And then when I used a more varied sample, the accuracy goes down quite a bit, but this is also using a much more varied sample. So some of this can be explained by a harsher cross-validation technique. Some of this could be explained by just the increased variance in my larger sample. Ultimately, despite having a decent classification accuracy in the first sample and not insignificant accuracy in the second sample, it was still quite hard to derive the relevant features, mainly because I used principal component analysis, which improves model performance, but it also kind of obfuscates the features away in favor of just providing the features which vary the most. I found that even when looking at the most significant, most highly varied features in the brain, they didn't cleanly map on ASD and TD, which is typically developing. So there's definitely a lot of other features that come into account to explain brain differences, but aren't very useful for diagnosis. So a future improvement to this model would be to try and find a better way of representing this data rather than just looking at these correlations, so this correlation matrix, and even with the thresholding improving performance, there are other techniques I could be using to improve both the interpretability of the model and perhaps accuracy if I can find novel ways of representing the relationships between these brain regions. So ultimately, there's a strong motivation to find these biomarkers, and machine learning does offer a novel way of doing so, but being able to interpret this and provide a more consistent way of diagnosis going forwards, especially when looking at a highly varied sample, is a little bit inconclusive for now, and I would have to look into more advanced machine learning techniques which might provide both better accuracy and maybe also a more understandable feature set. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my advisors, Dr. Chen and Dr. Tao.